Once upon a time, there was a man who had two sons. The elder of the sons was considered to be very smart and very sensible, and the younger, well, he was not quite so smart or quite so sensible as his elder brother. The father was a tailor, and he did his best to teach both of his sons his craft and trade. The elder, he took to the needle and thread like a bird takes to the air, or a fish takes to the sea. But the younger, well, he was forever getting the thread tangled about his fingers, and he couldn't cut so much as a straight line of cloth. He was his father's despair, especially when compared to his older brother. The older brother would do whatever was asked of him, and he would do it well and with a smile on his face, unless he was asked to go and fetch something after the sun had set, asked to go out in the dark, asked to walk across the graveyard. For if he was asked to do any such thing, he would say, "Oh no, oh no, oh no, I can't. Oh, it makes me shudder." When their father's friends came on dark nights, and they all gathered about the fire, and shadows were cast dancing on the walls, and stories were told, stories of things that go bump in the night, stories of goblins and ghouls, stories of terror and the imagination, again, the older brother would cry out, "Oh no, stop, please! Such tales! Oh, how they make me shudder!" The younger of the two did not understand this, and so one day he went to his older brother and asked him, "Brother, what is shuddering?" And the older brother replied, "Why, shuddering, that is what you do when you feel fear." The younger brother thought on this for a few days, and then went to his older brother and asked him, "Brother, what is fear?" The older brother replied, very matter-of-factly, "Fear is what makes you shudder." Now, as you can imagine, this did not really answer the younger brother's question. In fact, it sent him into something of a loop. What is shuddering? Shuddering is what you do when you feel fear. What is fear? Fear is the thing that makes you shudder. This ran over and over in his mind, and in fact he could concentrate on little else. He felt he could not go on with his life until he discovered what fear was, until he learnt how to shudder. And he began to drive his father to distraction, for he was constantly asking, "How do you shudder? How do you know what fear is?" One day the father was complaining of this to one of his friends, who happened to be the sexton of the local church. "The boy is driving me mad. He doesn't know what fear is." Now the sexton had a particular gift for telling the most spine-tingling tales, and he said to the father, "I think I have a plan to teach your young boy what fear is. Leave it to me, and soon he shall know how to shudder." That evening the sexton came to visit the tailor and his two sons, and as they sat by the fire, the sexton cleared his throat and prepared to tell a story. "I've been noticing that many young people seem to be using the graveyard by my church as a shortcut in their comings and goings. But I would warn against it, my young friends, especially in the hours of darkness." The older brother nodded his head, for he would never cross a graveyard, especially not at night. But the younger brother asked, "And why is that, old friend?" This was just the question the sexton had been waiting for, and so he began his tale. "Well, you see, my young friends, that graveyard has many stories, many tales, but this is the one I am going to tell you tonight. You see, long ago, doctors were trying to work out how the human body was put together, how the leg bone was attached to the knee bone, and all of that. But to do so, well, they had to examine some human bodies. And most living people, well, they tend to get a bit offended if you start poking around at their insides. So they needed to poke around at the insides of a few dead people. And where did they get the dead people? Well, that's where the resurrection men came in, also known as the body snatchers. You see, for the proper study of anatomy, you need something to dissect. You need a skeleton. But skeletons were in short supply. But the resurrection men, the body snatchers, well, they knew a few unofficial ways to obtain them. Under cover of darkness, they would creep into the graveyards where there had been a recent burial, because the doctors, they wanted fresh bodies. They didn't want ones that had started to smell. They would creep up to the grave and begin to dig. And they would dig up the freshly interred corpse, take it to the medical schools, and sell it to the anatomy labs. They had to be sneaky, because as you can imagine, most ordinary folk took a dim view of the idea that these body snatchers were going to come and take away Granny after they'd gone to all the trouble of digging her a proper grave. So that's why they always worked at night. Less chance of being seen, less chance of being caught. Now, one particular night, there was a pair of body snatchers, resurrection men. They were good at their job. They had been doing it for many years and had never once been caught. And they'd got in an order. The new term was starting, new skeletons were needed, and just when they needed it most, they heard that there had been a fresh burial. An old woman, a very rich old woman, had died and been buried in the local churchyard. So the two men got ready. They got their dark lantern, their shovels, their cart, their rope, and all of the other tricks of their trade. And they set off, under cover of night, to the churchyard. They wandered through the graveyard, looking for the plot, passing a few that they had already dug up before. And at last, they found the spot where the earth was freshly turned, and they began to dig. They dug and dug until they heard the thunk and knew that they had reached the coffin. They broke it open and pulled out the body of the old woman, wrapped in a shroud. But as they did so, the light from the dark lantern and the light from the moon shone and sparkled on something. The old woman had been very rich, and she had been buried wearing some of her jewellery. On her hand was a diamond ring, the biggest diamond either of the men had ever seen. They began to try to pull it off the old woman's finger, but she had been wearing the ring for many years, and it wouldn't come off. They pulled and they tugged, but still the ring would not move off her finger. They pulled and they twisted. One of the men even spat, hoping that his spit might help to loosen the finger coming off. The other thought this was quite disgusting, but he remembered hearing something about soap. Maybe they could go home, get some soap and bring it back. Or butter. Maybe butter would work. But his companion knew the time was short. If they left now, well, the body might be discovered. They would lose it, and they would lose the diamond ring. He was not willing to risk that, and so he took out his knife and cut. But just as he did so, there was a terrible scream. The old woman bolted straight upright, screaming louder than a banshee. She had not been dead at all. She had merely been in a deep sleep, and her relatives, assuming because of her great age that she must be dead, had quickly buried her and then began to argue over her belongings. But the two resurrection men were not to know this. They thought the body had come back to life, was screaming at them that they were now to be judged for their terrible crimes as resurrection men. This filled them with such terror that their hearts stopped, and they dropped down dead. But their ghosts still linger in that graveyard, for they are trying to atone for their crimes, for their lives as body snatchers. And if they find a living soul in that graveyard after dark, they assume that they must be there for the same crimes that they themselves committed in life. And I warn you, my young friends, do not be found by the ghosts of the resurrection men. Do not enter the graveyard once the sun has set. The sexton sat back after finishing his tale. The elder of the tailor's two sons was white as a sheet and had begun to shudder all over. The younger one, though, was looking up at the sexton and asked, "What happened to the old woman after they tried to cut off her finger?" This was not the reaction the sexton had expected. He waved his hand in the air and said, I think she went home and had a cup of tea and went on with the rest of her life." The conversation continued for a little while, but then the sexton, just as he was getting ready to leave, winked at the tailor. He turned to the younger of the two boys and said, "I am expecting a delivery tomorrow night. It's something very important, and so must be delivered into the hands of someone trusted. They will not be here until tomorrow night, and I fear, with my old bones, I wouldn't be able to stay up all night and wait for it. You, young fellow, you seem brave and strong. Would you wait by the church in the graveyard tomorrow night and receive the package for me?" Without thinking twice, the boy replied, "Oh, yes, of course. More than happy to help." The sexton gave the tailor another wink and left. The next night, true to his word, the younger brother was waiting outside the church among the tombstones, just as the sexton had asked him to. But the sexton's old bones were not quite as weary as he had claimed. While the youth had been waiting, he had been donning a costume, a white sheet, clanking chains, a lantern that let out an eerie glow, and he had been perfecting his howls and moans and other ghostly cries. When his costume was complete, he began to creep up behind the youth. When he was within a foot or two of him, he began to clank his chains and let out his moans and wails, certain that this apparition, after the terrifying story of the ghost of the resurrection men, would send the youth shuddering with fear all the way home. But the youth turned round, saw this terrible apparition, and assumed it must be the person with the parcel, the person he had been waiting for. He held out both his hands with a smile and said, "Oh, there you are. Do you need me to sign for the package?" This so astonished the sexton that he stepped backwards, not seeing one of the low gravestones, tumbled head over heel, and ended up twisting his ankle quite badly. The next day, the tailor went to visit his friend, to ask him how his plan had gone. The sexton was rather embarrassed. His plan had failed. He had failed to scare the youth, and he now had a very sore foot. "There is nothing for it, I am afraid. That boy does not know what fear is. The only thing I can think of is to send him out on a quest, as they did in days of old. Help him pack his bags with whatever he may need, and then send him out into the world. Tell him to go forth and to find what fear is." And so the youth packed his bags, took a little money given to him by his father, and went out to try to find what fear was, went out to try to learn how to shudder. He walked and he walked and he walked a great deal. He had no fear of travelling by night, because he didn't know what fear was. But he began to grow tired after a great deal of walking, and so decided he would stop at an inn. He ordered himself something to eat and something to drink, and sat down near the fire where it was warm. The landlady, seeing that he had clearly travelled a great distance, asked him where he was from, and what his business was, and where he was going. The youth replied that he did not know where he was going, and he had no clear business. He had been sent out to find what fear was, to learn how to shudder. A voice from the corner hearing this laughed and said, "If you want to find what fear is, you should go down to the Black Pond. That'll show you fear." The landlady shushed the person in the corner. But the youth was curious. He asked the landlady, who had a kind face, what was at the Black Pond that would teach him what fear was. The landlady shook her head. The Black Pond was home to something terrible. Some people said that it was a kelpie, others that it was a vengeful puka, but no one could be certain for sure. You see, the creature was old, and it was terrible. It was so terrible that you would not speak its name, not that anyone knew its name. The creature was that old that its name had been lost. They said that if you went down to the Black Pond when the moon was full, if you were on your own and you looked at the reflection of the moon in the dark, still waters, you would see them start to change. They would turn into something beautiful. Some would see the image of a great feast with all of the most succulent delights laid out for them. Others, it was said, would see a horse, a fine horse with a bridle of silver and a saddle just waiting to be sat on. Others still would see a person with loving eyes and arms open and calling to them. But whatever the person saw, it would be too beautiful for them to resist, and they would begin to enter the Black Pond. And once you entered the Black Pond, you were in the domain of the creature. It would drag you down and... The landlady shuddered. She didn't like to say what happened next. After all, no one could really be certain. No one had ever come back. The youth, though, did not take this story as the warning it was meant to be. He saw her shudder and thought, "At last, I have found where I will learn what fear is. If I go to the black pool when the moon is full, I too shall know how to shudder." He asked the landlady when was the next full moon, and was delighted to hear that it was in 2 days' time. He spent the next 2 days waiting for the full moon, wandering about the village, and picking up some little trinkets he thought would be interesting and adding them to his pack. He got a file, for his nails were becoming rather rough and broken, but the thing he was most pleased by was a small piece of wood with some little sticks of metal strapped onto it. The owner of the stall whom he bought it from said that it was a kalimba, or a thumb piano, and when you struck the metal with your thumb, it would make a note. The lengths of the metal meant that no matter what you struck, it was like an endless music box. For the way they were shaped, no matter what you struck, and in what order, they would always play a song, a sweet, slightly sad, but magical song. The youth thought that this would be most useful, for he did not know how long or how far he would have to travel, and this magical little music box would never run out of songs for him. On the night of the full moon, he took his little magic music box and some food given to him by the landlady and went to the black pool to try to learn what fear was, to learn how to shudder. He sat by the edge of the pool and watched the reflection of the moon in the dark waters. He took out his little music box and began to play with it. And as he played, and as he watched, the moon's reflection began to change. He saw a horse, the most magnificent horse he had ever seen. It seemed to toss its head in a blowing breeze that he could not feel. About its neck were silver bells hung on a bridle of gold. It was such a beautiful horse, but the youth did not know how to ride, and so he left the horse be, playing away with his little music box. The next thing he saw was a feast. A table almost groaning under the weight of puddings and pies, piled high with fruit, roast meats, fresh vegetables, bread straight from the oven. But there were no knives and forks laid out. And the youth reached into his bag as he played with his little music box, took out one of the sandwiches the landlady had given him, and munched away quite happily on his own picnic. Again the image in the dark pool changed, and this time it became a person, a woman, a truly beautiful woman. She had hair like sheets of gold, eyes like the night's sky, and she was looking at the youth, holding her arms out. She seemed to be calling to him to come to her. The youth's fingers, which were a little bit slippery with the butter from his sandwich, dropped the magic music box, and something between a hand and a tentacle, picked it up, shook it. A voice came from the dark pool. "Where has the song gone?" The image of the beautiful woman disappeared from the lake, and the youth saw the creature in its true form. It held the little music box, shook it again, and said, "Where has the song gone? Make it sing again. I want to hear that song one more time." The youth said, "You have to play it. See, like this." He took the little plank of wood with its little bits of metal and tapped it with his thumbs again. "But that is not the song it played before," said the creature. "I don't know what song it played before," said the youth. "You just tap them, and it makes a song." "You can do it in any order you like." "But I want the song I heard before," said the creature. "Well, I suppose," said the youth, "if you were to take it and just keep tapping away at it, I suppose eventually you'd come up with the same sequence of notes." He held out the little music box to the creature. It took it in a hand that seemed to be clawed and suckered and tentacled and scaly and slimy and dry all at once, and it tapped. And it tapped again. And it tapped a third time. And it went away, still tapping. Tapping away at all of the hundreds of thousands of possible variations. Tapping away in its watery lair until it would one day surely, come across the same sequence, find the same song that it had heard once before. The youth watched it disappear under the water, the sound still echoing in the air, and then he picked up his bag and went back to the inn, still no wiser as to what fear was, still not having learnt how to shudder. When he returned to the inn, the people were amazed to see him back alive, and the landlady herself nearly wept with joy. "Oh, you are such a brave and courageous lad! How ever did you survive?" The youth told them quite simply what had happened, and all who heard were astonished, because there was not even the faintest hint of fear in his voice. Someone said, "Why, this youth, he may even be brave enough to take up the king's challenge." For you see, there was a castle in this land, a very fine castle with a great hall and basements filled with treasure, but no living soul had been able to spend 3 nights there. For you see, the castle was now home to a demon. long, long ago, when the castle was still owned by a human lord, there had been a young demon, well, really more of a sprite, who had come up to earth for his first adventure abroad. He was looking forward to causing mischief among men, and for his first assignment, he decided to recreate one of the classics. One night, there was a terrible storm. The lightning crashed and the thunder roared. But the Lord was happy in his hall, by the fire, with some of his more disreputable friends, and they were playing cards. They played late into the night, and just as the clock was striking 3, there came a knocking upon the door. The lords looked at each other, wondering if it had been the thunder. But the knocking came again a second time. They called out for the servants to answer the door, but the knocking, it came a third time, and the Lord himself got out of his comfortable chair and went to open the door. He found a stranger there, wearing a hooded cloak. The hood was pulled down low over his face, presumably to protect it from the wind, and the cloak went right down to the ground and was wrapped tightly about the figure. As the storm was showing no signs of abating, the Lord invited the stranger inside to come to warm himself by the fire and dry off. The figure entered the hall, sat himself in a chair by the fire, but did not remove his cloak. The Lord thought this was a little bit strange, but he then went back to his card game. He played a few hands with his friends, mysteriously winning every round. One by one, the friends of the Lord put down their cards and went to bed, but he himself was not tired. One by one, the players left the game, until it was just the Lord and the stranger sitting by the fire. The Lord turned to the stranger, who still had not removed his cloak, and he asked if by any chance he would fancy a hand or two of cards. The stranger said yes, and moved to take a seat at the table. The two began to play. Now the Lord was very good at cards, and all night long it had seemed as though luck were on his side. But this stranger was also good, and also seemed to have brought his own mysterious luck to the table. As they played hand after hand, the Lord started to lose, and this infuriated him. He was not a man who liked to lose, and if he could not win fairly, he decided he would cheat. When the next hand was dealt out, he accidentally dropped one of the cards. He bent down under the table to retrieve the card and swap it for one he had hidden up his sleeve. But as he bent under the table, he saw the feet of the stranger. These were no ordinary feet, for the man he had welcomed into his home stood upon 2 cloven hooves. The Lord jumped back, knocking the table over. Cards fell out of his sleeves as he cried, "Demon! Demon!" pointing a shaky finger at the stranger. The stranger rose, removing his cloak. Upon his head there were 2 horns. He stood on 2 cloven feet, and a forked tail was lashing about like that of an angry cat. "Demon I may be, but I play fair. Unlike you, you cheat, you rogue. I shall take this castle as forfeit. It shall be mine, and mine alone, until there is one who can spend 3 nights under its roof. But any who is foolish enough to try, beware. They shall be driven mad with fear, or else die of terror in the attempt." And with that, the demon disappeared up the chimney. The Lord's hair had turned white with terror, and indeed fear had caused him to lose all his senses, for he rushed out of the castle into the storm, and from that night on, the demon was lord and master over the castle. No mortal had ever been able to spend more than 2 nights under its roof before either dying of fright or being driven mad with terror. The king himself had decreed that if anyone, noble or commoner, man or woman, old or young, was able to spend 3 nights in the castle and so drive away the demon, they would be given their weight in gold and ownership of the castle and all its lands. Many had tried to take up the king's challenge, but so far none had succeeded. When the youth heard of this, he thought, well, even if it doesn't teach me how to shudder, I suppose I could get a castle out of it. And so he set forth, not just to learn how to shudder, but to find the king and to win a castle. News of how he had defeated the creature in the black pond had travelled before him, and so he was easily admitted into the chamber of the king. The king sat in his robes of state, upon his throne of gold, with a crown perched on his head, and at his right hand his daughter, the princess. When the princess saw this youth come before them, she thought, he seems very brave, and he does look very handsome. I do hope he isn't killed by the demon of the castle. The king was delighted to hear that the youth had come to take up his challenge. It had been such a long time since any knights had come to test their bravery against the castle, and so he handed the youth the keys. He said that after each of the 3 nights, he and his daughter would come to check that the youth was still there, that he had not left, and of course, that he had not been killed or driven mad with fear. I am more than willing to risk being driven mad if only I can learn what fear is, if only I can learn how to shudder. The king thought this was a very peculiar thing for a young man to say, but he had to get back to ruling the kingdom, and so the youth went alone to the castle. It was indeed a very grand castle, and the youth spent the first day wandering around and exploring, and when it began to get dark, he went into one of the great bedchambers. There was a big 4-poster bed there. After he had shaken off some of the dust, the youth felt that this would be an excellent place to spend the night. He settled down among the pillows under the coverlet and was just dozing off when the demon began to work his mischief. He began to shake the bed, to rock it back and forth, but the youth was so soundly asleep that all he did was snore. The demon shook the bed more violently and bounced it upon the floor. This was enough to wake up the youth. The demon then began to rocket the bed all about the room, spinning it in loops and spirals. He thought the youth was screaming in terror, but then he discovered that no, that was not the cry of terror that came out of the mouth of the youth. It was a cry of delight. The youth was crying, "Yippee! Faster! Faster!" The demon was utterly disgusted by this, and so he turned the bed upside down, dropping the youth, the pillows, and all the blankets onto the floor. Oof! Well, I suppose that bed does not want to be slept in. Never mind, I have enough pillows and blankets here to make myself very comfortable upon the floor. And so saying, the youth made himself a little nest and went back to sleep. When morning came, the king and the princess came to the castle and knocked on the door to see if the youth was still there, or if he had been scared off by the demon. The king was very surprised to see the youth there, looking as if he had had a pleasant night's rest. And the princess found herself thinking, he is not only brave and handsome, but he seems to be lucky as well. On the second night, the youth lit a fire in one of the great fireplaces, built his nest of blankets and pillows, and settled himself down to sleep. But the demon was not ready to be defeated just yet. He opened a little door in the wall, a door that hadn't been there before, and a door that opened from this world to the other world. Out from that door came cats. Cats blacker than coal, blacker than midnight, the black cats of hell. These cats had burning eyes and razor-sharp claws. They began to prowl about the sleeping youth, and then one of them pounced upon his chest, ripping at his shirt with the razor claws. The youth woke up and saw the cat sitting on him. "Oh, hello, kitty." "Oh, what a lovely kitty you are, with such beautiful fur. But if you want to cuddle, kitty, I'm afraid we're going to have to do something about those sharp nails before they cut me." And without further ado, the youth reached into his bag, took out his nail file, and began to file down the sharp claws of the cat. The cats of hell had never encountered such insolence and disrespect, and so disgustedly scampered off to hell, all apart from the one cat who was getting an unexpected manicure from the youth. You see, it was rather comfortable, sitting there on a soft cushion next to the fire with someone stroking their head, and so the cat decided that it would try out being a pampered house cat for a little while. Just a brief sabbatical from hell. The next day, again, the king and the princess came to call on the youth, and were greeted at the castle gates by not only the youth, but by also a purring black cat. "I found this little kitty in the castle last night. Would you be able to take her back to the palace and see that she is well looked after?" The princess found herself thinking, he is not only brave, handsome and lucky, but he's kind too. If he survives tonight, I think I might ask him to marry me. On the third and final night, the demon decided he would need to pull out all of the stops if he was going to frighten away this youth. He had been thinking about it all day, sitting up in the chimney, plotting and planning, and he felt certain that this grand spectacular of the macabre would turn the youth's hair white. The youth himself, though, knew nothing of this. He was sitting by the fire, moaning the fact that he still had not learnt what fear was. He still did not know how to shudder. It was then he heard something like a clicking, something like a tapping, and it was coming closer and closer. The door opened, and in walked in a whole troop of skeletons, their bony feet clicking and tapping and clacking on the floor. They seemed to be in a jolly mood, for each had a grin plastered across his skull. They started to click their bones into the rhythm of a waltz. One took up his own shins and began to play his ribs like a xylophone, while the others started to dance and career all about the room. One who was without a partner grabbed the youth in a bony hand and pulled him into the dance. Round and round they twirled and twisted. Faster and faster. The youth found himself becoming quite short of breath, but the skeletons, they didn't need to slow down. After all, they didn't need to breathe. But as the dance got faster and faster, some of the bones began to come loose and go flying off as the skeletons enthusiastically spun each other about. But this didn't seem to dampen their fun. No, instead, one set about gathering up the femurs, fibulas and tibulas and setting them up like 9-pin bowls. Once they were arranged, he took off his own skull and sent it careering down, knocking into the bony pins. The others clapped their hands and were soon joining in, all bowling with their own skulls. The youth watched this, but saw that none of the skeletons were able to bowl straight. "I think I know how to fix this," he said, picking up one of the skulls that was rolling about the floor. He detached the jawbone and then began to rub the skull against the rough stone wall, filing it down and reshaping it into a smooth circular ball. Once that was done, he took aim at 9 of the still-standing bony pins and bowled a perfect strike. The skeletons, though, seemed to object. He was spoiling their fun. You were meant to bowl with your own skull. And as to the reshaping of the cranium, they called out to the demon who had sent them there, calling for him to act as referee. The demon, seeing that he had for a third time failed to frighten away the youth, became so angry that he blasted himself out of the chimney, exploding into the night sky like a firework. The skeletons applauded this pyrotechnic display, feeling it was an excellent end to their party, and then gathered up their bones and went back to wherever they had come from. On the third morning, the king and princess again came to the gates of the castle, where the youth met them, though he seemed sad. "Alas, I still have not found what fear is. I still don't know how to shudder." The king was delighted. "Congratulations, young man. You have succeeded where all before you failed. The castle is yours, along with all the treasures it contains and all the lands attached. I think there's a title to go with it as well." The princess looked at him and thought to herself, not only is he handsome, brave, lucky, and kind, but he is also rich, and my father seems to like him. I shall indeed marry this youth. And the youth was certainly not going to say no when a beautiful princess asked for his hand in marriage. But he was still troubled by the fact that he had not learnt what fear was. He still did not know how to shudder. He complained about this bitterly all through the preparations for the marriage, through the ceremony and the celebrations. The princess, who was already quite tired, had had enough of this. "Go to sleep, husband mine, and when you awake, I promise you, you will know how to shudder." The prince nodded, closed his eyes, and began to snore. The black cat, formerly of hell and now of the palace, leapt up onto the bed and curled up by his feet. The princess, though, she took a bucket and went out into the palace garden to where there was a little stream. She filled the bucket with icy cold water, and a few newts and frogs for good measure. When her bucket was full, she crept quietly as a shadow up the stairs and into the bridal chamber. She crept up to the side of the bed and in one quick motion threw the bucket of icy water all over the youth. The youth leapt up with a scream. "Ah, what is this? Oh, what is this?" he cried, pulling out a newt that had managed to get down the back of his nightshirt. "That, my dear," replied the princess, "is what it feels like to shudder. Now stop complaining and help me get some dry sheets from the bed." And the youth went through the rest of his life happy that he now knew how to shudder.